My guest today is a film industry pro. We discuss his amazing career as well as what makes a great story.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. I am the author of Dungeons for the Master, the Book of Random Tables, and other RPG resources that you can find at DiceGeeks.com or on Amazon.com. Just search for Random Tables on Amazon.com, and you will find my books. Now, this is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. My guest today is not a gamer, but I don't want you to stop listening because my guest today is an amazing storyteller. He has had and continues to have an amazing career in Hollywood. I do apologize. I think a couple of times I geeked out so hard that I didn't even know what I was saying. So I apologize for that. But you have to understand that my guest today has been involved in some amazing projects. He is the director of the movie The Last Legion. He also directed Dragonheart, A New Beginning. He was the storyboard artist and worked on Deadpool 2, Pacific Rim: The Uprising, the original G.I. Joe cartoon. In addition to that, he has also directed numerous episodes of TV shows, very popular TV shows, and that is just all the stuff we did not talk about in today's interview. So please stay tuned. You definitely want to hear about my guest's career as well as his take on writing and telling stories. Perhaps I should also apologize for taking up most of the interview with questions about one feature film that my guest wrote. It is called Steel Dawn. It is a post-apocalyptic movie that came out in 1987. I didn't see it until a few years later. It would have been 89, maybe even 1990, when I saw it on VHS. And while it's not the most prominent of my guests' works, it made such an impact on me at the time that I saw it. I would have been 15 or so, maybe 16 years old, and I was obsessed with the post-apocalyptic genre. Obviously, Mad Max, Road Warrior, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, and some other movies. But also at the time, I was reading Joe Dever's Highway Holocaust, which is a book series, a post-apocalyptic setting, and their game books. And if you haven't seen those are incredible. And so I was just fascinated with this idea of a post-apocalyptic kind of ruined world, collapsed civilization at the time. And so when I brought home Steel Dawn from the video store and I put that in my old VCR and I fired it up and I see Patrick Swayze with an incredibly cool sword doing awesome martial arts in a post-apocalyptic story, I completely lost it. So here is today's interview. My guest today is head of story at the Third Floor, and his film and television credits span from storyboard artist to writer to director, Doug Lefler. Doug, welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thank you so much. This is an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. Could you perhaps define what head of story means and tell us a little about the Third Floor?
The Third Floor is a visualization company. We do previs for a lot of the big Marvel movies, Star Wars series, a lot of films for Disney, Legendary. Previs is kind of like a computer-generated storyboard or animated storyboard. I run the story department, which means that I manage the storyboard artists, and I am a storyboard artist myself, as you mentioned. The Third Floor, one of the things I think that distinguishes it from other previs companies is that they consider storyboards to be previs. And in truth, anything that helps you visualize something before you actually make it is part of the pre-visualization process. So I head this department and I manage the other storyboard artists. I hire storyboard artists and oversee what they're doing. And then we also occasionally create new content here as part of this department.
Okay. How did your career in film begin?
I went to California Institute of the Arts a very long time ago. I was there the first year that the Disney character animation program was in existence. And how I got there, it's still a little bit of a mystery to me, except I used to make a lot of films and I used to draw a lot. Before I knew what a storyboard was, I was drawing storyboards because that seemed like it was the best way. Drawing a picture of what the film was going to look like seemed like it was a better way of planning than writing a script for it to me at that time when I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. So I had come to the attention of the personnel department at Disney, along with some of my friends that I would make films with. And when I was a senior in high school, I got a phone call from Ed Hansen, who was the head of personnel at Disney Feature Animation at that time. And he invited me to send a portfolio. And I wasn't sure if it was legitimate or if it was one of my friends playing a joke on me. But I submitted a portfolio, and then about a month later, I was told I was being given a full scholarship to this new character animation program that they had started at CalArts. I wasn't planning on going to art school. I wasn't planning to even go to college at that point. I was working for some small production companies in Santa Barbara, which is where I'm from. And I thought the best thing I could do to eventually work in the film industry would be just to keep working for these small production companies and try to work my way up. But when I got a call from Disney, they said, we want you to join this program and we're going to give you a full scholarship. I decided I should do that. So I went there and I was there for 2 years. And at the end, it was a 4-year program, but at the end of the second year, my old roommate, who was this guy named Brad Bird, came to me and said, you, John Musker, Jerry Reese, and I are wanted in the dean's office. And I said, are we in trouble? And Brad said, I think they're going to offer us jobs at the studio, at Disney Studio. And I said to Brad, you're crazy, Brad. They're going to offer John and Jerry jobs, but they're not going to offer you and I jobs. But he was right. I was wrong. They offered us employment. I had student loans at that time, which were driving me nuts. I think I owed something like $2,000 in student loan debt at that point, which seems like nothing now, but it was horrifying at that time. Uh-huh. So when they said, would you consider leaving school to come work for us? I said, let me think about it. Yes. So John Musker, Jerry Reese, Brad Bird, and I started, and this was 1977, which I can remember because it was the year Star Wars came out.
Yeah, well, there you go.
And we all went and saw Star Wars together at the Grauman's Chinese Theater. Oh my gosh. It was actually, I have to say, it was a really exciting time to start your career in the film industry because you felt like all the rules just changed and that there was so much more opportunity and possibility. So I worked at Disney in feature animation for 4 years. I was an animator and a storyboard artist. I worked my way from animation into the story department because that was a part of the process that interested me the most. And then eventually I left and went to work in other parts of the industry. I never intended to work in 2D animation. I always wanted to work in live action. Mm-hmm. I thought at one point when I was trying to figure out how I'd make that transition, I thought storyboards might be a good way to do it. Since I was doing animation storyboards, I figured I could just segue into doing storyboards for live action films. Mm-hmm. So to further that end, I went to talk to somebody who was working in the animation building who was storyboarding a film. And I can't remember his name, but he's somebody who had started his career working with Albert Hitchcock and John Ford. And when I met him, he was doing Herbie Goes Bananas. And he jokes that he had started his career at the top and had been working his way down ever since.
Oh, no.
So I asked him about storyboards, and he said, I would be happy to tell you everything that I know, or at least as much as I can. He said, first, I have to warn you, though, if you go down this path, it's a dead end. If you become a storyboard artist, you can't do anything else. You can't become a production designer or art direction. You'll be stuck doing this for the rest of your career. He said, you can make good money, and it's not a bad way to make a living, but you should just be warned. You should just know that. So I said, I thanked him for that, and I still listened to everything he had to say. But when I left his office, I remember feeling thankful that I talked to him, because he obviously saved me from making a horrible mistake. So when I left Disney, eventually, I was focusing on two things, on screenwriting and on illustration. And I figured I could write scripts and then I could illustrate them to help me sell them. That was my plan at the time. It was hard to get people to pay me money to do that at that time. And eventually I got to the point where I just didn't have any money and I needed a job desperately. And somebody offered me a storyboarding job. And I thought I was maybe making a horrible mistake, but I took it because I needed the money. And from the first day that I started working as a storyboard artist, I found that my experience was completely different than this veteran storyboard artist that I had talked to. And I don't think that he had lied to me. I think he told me what was his truth. And maybe it was just the times had changed. I also think maybe I brought something different to the job than he did. One of the great things about storyboarding, I'd also say this is true about directing, is that everybody comes from a different angle and everybody brings something different to it. Some people bring more design skills to the job than I do. But one of the things I believe I brought was a sense of storytelling that has served me well in my career. So from the beginning, I found that storyboarding and being a good storyboard artist led me to many, many other opportunities. It led to the opportunity to write, to direct, and occasionally to produce.
Okay. Now, when you create storyboards, are you working with the director, the screenwriter, the producers, or all of the above?
All of the above and none of the above.
Okay.
The truth is, that is a question that I'm asked very frequently, and the answer is it's different every time. Okay. Sometimes you work with a director who will just sit down with you and talk you through every single shot and every single angle. I would say that's very rare. First of all, there's not that many directors that actually know what they want well enough to do that, or have enough experience to explain it to you, what shot they want and how all those shots are going to fit together. I have been fortunate enough to work with some directors that could do that and were great at that. Sam Raimi comes to mind. John Woo, also, I storyboarded his first American film. I really enjoyed working with both of them. Learned a lot from both of them also. And I was working with Sam Raimi on a film called Army of Darkness, and I had storyboarded that whole film, and that actually led to the opportunity for me to direct second unit on that film, because Sam and I had worked so closely together on it that he felt he could trust me to direct second unit because I knew how all the pieces were supposed to fit together. So that was that launched my second unit directing career, which led into a main unit directing career.
Now, that's incredible. But just thinking, like, is every shot in a movie storyboarded, or are there shots that they just don't storyboard?
I would say it's rare that every shot in the film is storyboarded. There's been a few times I've done that. Actually, when I was working with Sam on Army of Darkness, I storyboarded almost everything. One film I know I storyboarded every shot for was Quick and the Dead, which we did together. But generally, no. And there is you can make an argument that it's not good to storyboard every shot. There are some scenes that are better served by being more spontaneous and improvised. I do think it's important that directors are able to improvise and able to work out blocking and coverage on the set. I think that's an important skill to have. When I was directing, there were times when I intentionally didn't plan beforehand because I wanted to develop the ability to be more spontaneous on the set. In the final analysis, I would say what worked best for me was to plan something out, but then be willing to deviate from it. And I found that if you had a plan going in, you were better off. It was easier to explain to everybody what you were going to do differently. If you could say, well, remember how we did plan to start this with a wide tracking shot, but instead of doing that, we're going to just move to the end of the scene and focus on a lockdown angle of the complete set. If you have a starting point, if people knew what a plan was to begin, it was easier to explain how you're going to deviate from it. So I found that usually yielded better results for me. So not every shot needs to be storyboarded or prevised. And I would say it's rare that every shot is storyboarded and or prevised.
Okay. Now, you mentioned second unit directing and that you were the second unit director of Army of Darkness.
Yeah.
And then I know you were also the second unit director on the 2002 Spider-Man, which of course was directed by Sam Raimi as well.
Yes.
Could you just maybe describe second unit directing just a little bit, what they do? I know some in the audience may not be familiar.
Well, it's generally you are helping the main unit director on things that he or she doesn't have time to do. They don't fit neatly into the schedule. Sometimes second unit is just doing insert shots. So if you have a scene between two people are driving in a car and checking their mobile phones, the main unit director may do the dialogue working with the actors, cover all of that, and then the second unit may come in and shoot the inserts of the close-ups of the phones, close-ups of the feet on the gas pedal, the speedometer. It's also sometimes second unit is for stunt work where there's going to be a long setup time to make things safe and spectacular. So it's usually it facilitates a schedule. Second unit is there to help with some of the time heavy requirements of shooting that the director can't do or doesn't want to do. And in theory, it's so that the main unit director can focus on working with the acting talent and things that are more critical to the overall performances of the film and look of the film.
Okay. Now I noticed looking at your IMDb page, you were involved in a lot of projects that had some almost perhaps formative kind of qualities in my childhood and in my kind of young teens and things, early teens. I noticed that you had worked on Transformers, that you have credits for a number of the animation. I noticed Denver the Last Dinosaur, that you not only were storyboard artists, but you wrote a number of episodes for that.
Yes.
And then I noticed one, Vitor, the Starfire Champion.
Yes.
That you were the writer on that. I just find it interesting. I didn't watch Denver too much, but I remember seeing Vitor on TV.
Really?
And
wow.
And I kept wondering when it was going to be a series, and of course it was just. I think they did do a series.
They did do a series. Yeah. I wrote a bunch of them. But I wrote the pilot episode of that. Before we move on to that, actually, can I just jump back to? There was one other thing I wanted to mention about second unit direction, just because you brought it up. You had mentioned that I had done second unit on Spider-Man, the first Sam Raimi. Tobey Maguire starring Spider-Man. Yeah. I was one of five second unit directors. However, only two of us ended up getting credit on the film. But I just didn't want people to think that I had shot second unit on all of that. I did, however, shoot the montage of Spider-Man being Spider-Man for the first time. That's in the middle of the film. So I got to shoot Spider-Man in his spider costume, like the armored car robbery and that whole section.
Yeah.
But anyway, so moving on. Well, it's interesting. I'm delighted that you actually know what Vitor the Starfire Champion is.
Yeah.
And Denver was fun because my wife and I were the lead writers on that. So yes, and in terms of Transformers, I did storyboard a bunch of those episodes, and where I'm working here at the third floor, that is possibly the credit that impresses my coworkers the most, because I think somehow that series was very formative to a lot of people here that are younger than myself. It was great working on that. At that time, I was a single guy living in Hollywood, and I was making about $1,200 a week doing storyboards. And in the early 80s, that was a lot of money.
Yeah.
Which I was not spending necessarily wisely at the time, but.
Well, I noticed too, like, Denver, the Last Dinosaur, Vitor, and then I think Sabre Riders as well. You have a credit on Sabre Riders.
Yeah.
Those were all produced by World Event Productions, which happens to be based here in St. Louis, where I'm.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, that's true.
And so I was just kind of wondering if there was any St. Louis connection, or if it just kind of happened that way.
There was a connection. I mean, that was the World Events was a company that was producing that. They were working with an animation company that I believe was called Calico. And they were the ones that had hired me initially to work on the scripts. At the time, I don't think they had ever worked in animation before, so they didn't really know how the process worked. Mm-hmm. And I believe I was recommended for that job by somebody who had been a coworker of mine at Disney when I was in the feature animation department. And they were looking for somebody to write the story, and she recommended me. But that was fun. It was fun working on that, working with a guy named Tom Burton, I believe, who was the head creative at Calico. And then there was the producer was somebody named Peter Keefe, who I believe is no longer with us now. He passed away some time ago. And he was kind of a bigger than life character, but I enjoyed working with all of them. That was a fun period of time.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I just to see some of those credits, it just kind of reawakened some memories, like I said, when I saw Vitor.
See, now those are not the credits I would necessarily have thought people would have. That would have impressed people.
Yeah, and I was looking. I know when I link up all of your personal site and your IMDb page to the show notes of this episode, I know people will be like, "Why is he asking these questions?" But but it's my show, and
it's your show, so you get to ask the questions you want. Damn it!
Yes, exactly. And so Vitor was really cool. Yeah. And
Vitor, I remember Vitor as being a lot of fun. I remember pitching Vitor as being a combination of Tarzan and a ninja.
Okay.
I remember enjoying that experience a lot. I just never thought that it would endure and that we would be talking about it 30 years later. But it does my soul good.
Well, I'm glad to help, but there was at least one teenager who was probably a little too old to be watching cartoons in St. Louis, Missouri, that was watching cartoons then 30 years ago.
Excellent.
But also kind of sticking with the 80s. I don't know if it's a theme here or not, or if I need to grow up and get out of the 80s or something. But during the 80s, probably just because of some financial considerations and things, because of the popularity of the Mad Max movies, I was obsessed with post-apocalyptic movies.
Yeah.
And I just absolutely obsessed with them. And, I just remember, every chance I got, when we went to the video store, just kind of looking around and trying to find post-apocalyptic movies. Mm-hmm. And so one trip to the video store when I was probably 15 or 16, I picked up a movie called Steel Dawn.
Mm-hmm.
And you are credited as having written Steel Dawn. Can you tell me just a little bit, tell us how you got involved with that film?
Well, it was an original script that I wrote. It was a spec script. I had I'd been a big fan of like 70s samurai films, and I really wanted to pay homage to that. So I did something that was sort of like a post-apocalyptic samurai movie. And it was, the story was basically the story of the old Western Shane. The original title for the project was Nomad.
Okay.
And it was produced by a company called Vestron, which had made a lot of money in the nascent video tape rental business. They had licensed film from studios because nobody knew that renting videotapes was going to be a business that anybody, that would go anywhere. So they managed to make a lot of money. And then some of the companies like Vestron started producing their own content. They might also have seen the writing on the wall that the studios were going to start releasing their own VHS tape versions of things. And then, of course, later laser discs, and then DVDs, and then Blu-rays. But there was a period during the 80s when there was a lot of money around, and a lot of small production companies were springing up that were doing things like this. And in the United States, there weren't a lot of people that were paying attention to Japanese cinema or Hong Kong cinema at the time, but I loved both of them. And when the script got to Lance Houle, he really wanted to do a Western, but nobody was making Westerns at that time. So I wanted to do a samurai film. He wanted to do a Western, and we thought, that maybe the two could meet somewhere in the middle. I had in my mind something that was a little bit more comic booky probably than he did. I can tell you, you probably know from my credits that I directed the pilot episode of Xena, Warrior Princess.
Yes.
And prior to that, Xena actually appeared in Hercules, the Legendary Journeys. And I had directed the pilot episode of that as well. So we introduced Xena halfway through the first season of Hercules. And when I was talking with Rob Tappert about the character, we wanted to give her some signature weapon. I said, well, I come up with this idea for something I was going to use in Steel Dawn. But the producer just couldn't wrap his head around it. And the idea was that the character of Nomad was going to have this disc that he could throw, be kind of like a boomerang, or behave like a boomerang, where the outer edge was sharp, but the inner part of the circle was dull. So he could throw it, he could catch it, but he always had to catch it by grabbing it from the inside. The producer, Lance, who produced and directed it, just couldn't figure out how to make that work. It seemed just a little over the top to him. So we cut it from Steel Dawn. And then that idea, though, eventually became Xena's chakra that she used in that series, and is one of the more iconic things about her character. But yes, originally that was going to be the character that Patrick Swayze played in Steel Dawn was going to have that disc that he threw. That was going to be his signature weapon. Did I talk about the origins of the title? It wasn't called Steel Dawn in my script. My script was called Nomad.
Okay.
At that time, though, there was a film called Nomads. I think Pierce Brosnan was in.
Yeah.
And Vestron didn't want the two to get confused on the shelves of the video stores, so they said we had to change it. I gave them like 3 pages of alternate title ideas. Steel Dawn was not on any of those 3 pages. And I never liked it for a couple of reasons. One was Patrick Swayze had been in a John Milius film called Red Dawn. And I think I was concerned people would think that it would mistake it as a sequel. I think maybe that was part of Vestron's devious plan.
Oh, a secret marketing tactic, perhaps.
Perhaps.
Okay.
Also, at that time, there was a woman executive, I believe, at Paramount, named Dawn Steele, and I wondered what she thought of this film coming out. Steele Dawn. But yeah, so my script was called Nomad, and of course the character had no name in the story, but he was referred to as in the script as Nomad, and I believe we ever mentioned his name anywhere in any dialogue.
No. Yeah, I just watched it yesterday again.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yes,
you're a glutton for punishment.
Oh, no. I enjoy it. But just thinking of, you said it was a spec script. So, and you drew some inspiration from samurai films, and then Shane, the classic Western from Stevens. I would assume that, Mad Max and some, you had some other influences as well as you were thinking about it. Of course,
yes. At that time, it was impossible to be working in the film industry and not be influenced by Mad Max. Mm-hmm. That was such a powerful force at that time. So, yes, that's where the post-apocalyptic part of it came from. Mm-hmm. But and then the thought of doing something like that, but making it more of a martial arts film was intriguing to me. I was writing a lot of spec scripts in those days, and I was a little surprised that script was the one that sold before some of the other ones that I'd written. When the film, it's interesting. There have other people have approached me recently about this film to talk about it. I'm a little surprised that it has had sort of a resurgence in popularity. I was really disappointed in the film when I saw the final product. And I think it's maybe one of the reasons I started thinking about becoming a director myself is because I just had pictured it differently, and I was disappointed. But in truth, I'm usually disappointed in everything that I do. It never seems to match what I had in mind. Yeah. So a lot of things that I have directed myself, I'm also disappointed in. So I don't think it's any reflection on Lance of the project.
Okay. Now, as a writer, are you on set with everybody, or?
I was not on that film. Yeah, they shot it in South Africa. They didn't have the budget to take the writer along. So I gave them the script, but I also then did storyboards for the director and sent them down there. But I actually had very little to do with the production once it got started. Okay. Which is strange because as a storyboard artist, I've found I was having a profound influence on a lot of the films that I was working on. But I didn't have as much of a say in the one that I had written, which seemed odd to me at the time. But like I said, they shot in South Africa, and I was in Los Angeles for that.
Okay. Just trying to think of kind of like post-apocalyptic as kind of a genre. Do you think what is the appeal behind that kind of genre? Because, it just seems like every so often we still get, from Hollywood, just another kind of, post-apocalyptic film, whether it's post-nuclear or post-virus or something like that, disaster. What do you think the appeal is there?
Well, I actually think that Lance Houle was onto something when he was wanting to make a Western, because I think that the appeal of Westerns and the appeal of the post-apocalyptic genre are very similar. It's kind of getting back to a time when there were no laws, when they're usually stories about mavericks. And there is something I think that is just deeply entrenched in American culture, that we love the idea of the stoic loner. And the characters like that appear in a lot of different genres, but I do feel like there is some connection between the post-apocalyptic films and Westerns. Not the least is that they each make a comeback every now and then, even if it's short-lived.
Yeah. I think it's definitely something to do with lack of law or the kind of an anarchic kind of state, because that allows then for somebody to oppress, like good people, somebody evil to come in and oppress. And of course, that just is the catalyst for almost every story, I would imagine.
I think that is sort of true. But you know what? The best stories, I feel like as a writer, I'm much less interested in stories about good guys versus bad guys as I am just about two strong people who are butting heads together.
Mm-hmm.
And if you like watch Shane again, the antagonist of the story, actually makes a lot of sense when you hear him explaining his law, why he's behaving the way he is, and you get the sense that both he and the main character Shane are people that are at the end of their time. It's like they were like violent people who survived and prospered when there were no laws, that are now at the cusp of a time when laws are coming back in, or getting established for the first time, and that their days are numbered. But in storytelling, I love being able to create stories that don't actually have a specific villain in them. They just have two characters who have a strong desire for something that is mutually exclusive, and only one of them can have what they want.
Oh, that's interesting. Why do you think you prefer that over, say, like a stark good and evil?
Because it's more complicated, and it's more complicated. Actually, that's the wrong way to describe it. I think it's more interesting because you don't know for sure who's going to win or what's right or what's wrong. You can sustain the drama longer, and I think it is just in real life. That's the way it is. Is that nobody thinks of themselves as the villain. They have an agenda that's different than other people's, and everybody assumes that they're right. I guess there is something about doing stories that are in the fantasy, science fiction, or action genre that I really appreciated it when they're allegories for other things. One of the things I think about with fantasy is that fantasy can actually tell us more about life than drama can, in the same way that a caricature can tell you more about a person than a photograph. Like, you have a chance to sort of distill things down to their raw elements and say something that is true, but dress it up in a very stylized way that makes it more palatable. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, certainly. I think science fiction and fantasy, yes, they can tell us a story because they disconnect us from our culture and kind of our ingrained, and we're able to look at it kind of almost objectively.
And if I can give a shout out to my old roommate, Brad Bird, I think one of the films where that was done so beautifully is The Incredibles. I feel like there's so much dimension and depth in that story. When it's a story about superheroes that have been put out of business, but it just rings true. It's a lot of Brad's work does.
Okay. So when you sit down to write, or you maybe, I don't know if this is the right one, when you sit down to write a story, or if you pick up a screenplay and you're going to read it, what tells you that that's a good story?
Well, I know when I'm going to write a story, what I really need to find out is what the character wants. I get excited about a story when it's a story about somebody that wants something very badly and is willing to do extreme things to get what they want. The stories that are least interesting to me are stories that just happen to people. For instance, one of the reasons why I really appreciate Game of Thrones was just that the characters actually made choices. Sometimes they made bad choices, but they made strong choices, and those choices had consequences that motivated the story. I'm less interested in stories like the Harry Potter series, although I've seen all of the films and I've read a number of those books. But that's more of a story that just happens to the character. And frankly, from what I can see, I actually think the more interesting story in all of that, in that particular series, was the backstory about Harry's parents and their contemporaries. That's a story I wish that J.K. Rowling would write. Because those characters actually caused things to happen much more, and it seemed like their kids were then dealing with the consequences of the things that they had done. But for me to get excited about a story, I want to see the characters causing the story to happen, and not just that it's something that happens to them.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we get engaged in stories when we can watch them wanting to know what the characters are going to do next. And we're less engaged with the stories if we're sitting there wondering what's going to happen to them next. Maybe it seems like it's a subtle difference, but it's profound in terms of the experience. One, you're engaged because you're sitting there guessing what the character is going to do next. You're more of a participant in the story. If you're waiting to see what the characters are going to do next. You're more a victim of the story if you're waiting to see what's going to happen to them next.
No, I think that's a very good insight. Now, I guess, what are you working on now, and what does the future hold?
Well, the third floor has started this new initiative called Story Attic, where we're creating original content. And our plan now is we are creating stories as digital comics first, as a testing ground, and then we're going to grow those stories that we like into animatics, into animated episodes, and then eventually try to sell them as film, television, novels, other mediums. But we want to start off doing them as digital comics, graphic novels, because that's the least expensive way that we can publish them now. The plan is to do a lot of content, to just continually output new stories, and plan on most of those stories falling by the wayside. But the more you do of anything, the better you get at it. I was fortunate enough when I was a kid to have gotten to know Ray Bradbury.
Oh, wow.
And he was still alive. And by fortunate enough, what I mean is I was persistent enough. I kept writing him letters until he agreed to meet with me. But what Ray used to do, or at least the way he claimed he did, and I have no reason not to believe him, he had a sign over his typewriter that said, "Don't think." And he would go into his office every day and he would sit down, supposedly with no idea what he was going to write. And he'd just start typing words, and he would just write a short story. And he would try to write a short story every day. And he said by the end of the month, he would have like 20 of them. He said 17 of them were crap. 2 of them were okay, and 1 of them was good. And that's the one that he would finish. And that, to me, it's always struck me as the best writing advice anybody can have. So many times we start on these projects and we'll just try to beat them into submission. And I think that there is something to the idea of just creating a lot of content, not having any of it be precious. Work hard on it and refine it, but just keep producing content and keep moving on. And I think when you create a lot of content, 3 things happen. One, the laws of average works in your favor, because even a broken clock is correct twice a day. 2 is that anything you do a lot of, you get better at. And 3, and most importantly, is I feel you get out of your own way. I think when we go to create something, when we go to write a story, our first 3 to 5 ideas are going to be our versions of something we love, which is a very viable way to get started. We do we usually get into the arts because we got inspired. So we all have things that we love and we want to emulate. But then I think after your third, your fourth, fifth, or sixth idea, you start coming up with ideas that just exist for their own sake. And often I find that those are the better ideas. So the plan here is we are just creating a lot of content. We're creating content in short form. So all of the stories are designed to be read in a 3 to 10 minute time period. Some of them are ongoing episodes of the series. And we're outputting one every 2 weeks, I believe now we're publishing. And we have a website, storyaddict.com. And I had also invented a digital comics format called Scroll-On, which has no pages or borders. It's just like an infinite canvas. But it's designed for tablets and smartphones. So we're publishing all of our digital comics in that format.
Oh, okay.
The most recent film that I worked on is I did some storyboards for Andy Serkis on Venom 2.
Okay.
And it was a delight being able to work with him.
Yeah. I can only imagine.
I was completely geeking out when I met him the first time.
I bet. I bet. I'm trying not to geek out talking to you. So, I mean, that sounds fantastic, and definitely I'll provide links to those at the show notes at dicegeeks.com. Also, I guess you were mentioning Ray Bradbury. Did you enjoy the films of Ray Harryhausen?
Oh, I wanted to be Ray Harryhausen when I was a kid. I in fact, if you go to my website in the scrapbook section of DougLefler.com, there are some pictures of some of my early armatures that I made when I wanted to be a stop motion animator. Oh, wow. But I changed my mind before I got out of high school. At that time, I never actually got to meet Ray Harryhausen, but I met Jim Danforth and David Allen, some of the other guys that were working at that time. And it was a little depressing because everybody was out of work. Now, this was pre-Star Wars, and there just wasn't a lot of fantasy film or science fiction for these guys to work on. And it had occurred to me at the time, though, that the films, when they didn't work, it wasn't because of a lack of quality or artistry in the visual effects. It was because of the story. Yeah. So I thought I might be better served if I segued out of being a stop motion animator and into some aspect of the job where I could have an influence on the storytelling.
Yeah.
And the planning.
No, I just find that kind of fascinating. The first episode of my podcast, I was able to interview John Walsh, who is a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation. So,
great.
I was just kind of interested to hear that. And then,
and of course, Ray Bradbury and Ray Harryhausen went to high school together, I think. I mean, they were friends.
Yeah.
Something like that, yes. There was one time when I was with Ray and he said, "Oh yeah, I was just talking to Harryhausen and I thought I would invite him over here to join us for lunch, but I was afraid he just would do it as a favor to me." I said, "Why didn't you?"
No kidding. Yeah. And then, I guess, too, something I ask all my guests, because my audience is kind of focused on tabletop role-playing games, and we tell stories all the time. Have you ever played Dungeons & Dragons? Or
I have not. I work with a lot of people who have. That was a big part of their childhood. I think it was a generational thing for me. I'm sure I would have gotten heavily into that had I been born a decade later.
Sure.
I started out young in the industry, but I've been in it a very long time now. So there are a lot of cultural things that I think I have missed just because at the time when they were becoming popular, like playing video games, I was so obsessed with my career at that time, I just didn't stop to do things like that. A couple of years ago, I actually did feel like I should learn more about the video game business. I actually work with video game companies a lot, and I also feel like there's so many storytelling opportunities there that I did try to learn how to play video games, and I was miserable at it. But I figured, you can go online and YouTube, you can find videos on how to tie a bow tie, on how to mix a cocktail. Surely I could find a video just on the basics of how to play video games. And what I found is a plethora of videos of like how to reach the 10th level of Doom or something, but not like on just like, how do you hold the controller? How do you make things go up or down, left and right? Just really basic things. And I thought, well, maybe I should just walk around the neighborhood and find a 10-year-old kid and ask him how to do that. And then I thought better of that plan. I didn't want to get arrested. So no, unfortunately, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I have never played Dungeons and Dragons, and I feel lesser for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's still time.
Yeah, there's still time.
Well, now, Doug, I think I could just ask you questions all day. I grew up obsessed with movies. I tried to work in movies until about 9 years ago, and then I decided I needed food. So I gave it up in some cases, or I career pivoted in other ways. Yeah. So I just really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. Like I said, I can just continue to ask you questions, but I'll respect your time. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Well, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed today's interview with Doug Lefler. I am still geeking out. It was an amazing opportunity to be able to talk with Doug, and I am so thankful that he was gracious with his time and was willing to come on the show. In today's episode, we talked about a lot of Doug's projects. I have linked those up in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. You can find them there. You can find Doug's graphic novel technology that he invented called Scroll On. You can find Doug's original story initiative at storyattic.com. It is linked up there. You will also find his IMDb page, so you can explore all the incredible projects that Doug has worked on throughout his career. If you want me to continue to keep providing awesome content and fantastic interviews for you each week, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/dicegeeks and check out the different levels of support there. Every bit of support is greatly appreciated, and it just lets me know that you want me to continue making this show. Also, if you want something for free, please go to dicegeeks.com/free, and you will get some free dungeon maps and some other resources that you can use in your games, and you will never miss an episode of this show. I thank you so much for listening to the show today, and until next time, keep gaming.